Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you're having a fabulous day today. If you are interested in true crime stories like I am, I hope that you would consider hitting that subscribe button. But either way, thanks for being here. Today we're going to be talking about the tragic story of Brandon Teena. While it is undoubtedly a hard one to listen to, it is vital that his name not be forgotten, and also the other two innocent lives that were also taken in a horrific, premeditated attack. Who Brandon was. His birth name is Teena Renee Brandon, born on December 12, 1972. From an early age, Brandon, as he chose to identify, grappled with understanding his gender and sexuality. He had been born female and was attracted to women, but didn't feel like the title lesbian accurately knew who he was inside. By the time Brandon was in high school, he had asked others to call him Billy, or sometimes Teena Ray, and was dating girls who went to other schools. Brandon occasionally opened up to others about his feelings towards gender identity and his attraction to women. Still, sadly, he found very few people willing to lend an understanding ear. Brandon's high school girlfriends only had good things to say about him as a partner. He was the perfect boyfriend, so much so that Brandon was engaged on 2 occasions, as he was kind of, he liked the girls and he spoiled the ladies. Let's dive into this deeper and discuss the tragic occurrence, but first, a word from today's sponsor. Thanks to Woodoku for sponsoring today's video. Woodoku is a game that players need to arrange the wooden blocks to form a line or a square, which clears tiles from the board to earn points. I had a 5-hour layover coming to Georgia, and the time flew by so fast playing this game. I hate waiting for anything, and I get anxiety around a ton of people. So I grab my phone and I start playing, and I don't even notice the weight or people around me. Almost calming in a weird way. The game is completely free to download and play on both iOS and Android devices. This game offers hundreds of challenging levels and is great practice for testing IQ and intelligence. My highest score happened to be a 80. I only reached that once and I play often. I'm sure you guys will beat me no problem, but I'd love to hear what your score is down below. Download Woodoku from the link in my description, as it really helps my channel out because it's sponsors like this that make these videos possible. Thanks to Woodoku for sponsoring today's video, and thanks to all of you for listening. Brandon sometimes told others that he was a hermaphrodite, likely due to his conflicting feelings inside or as a way to be accepted by others. Others tried to blow Brandon's identity off as a phase. It was just a different time then than it is now. But expressing himself this way was the only time Brandon felt he was living his authentic self. He bound his breasts daily and wore masculine clothing with a rolled up sock stuffed inside his underwear. His end goal was to afford gender reaffirming surgery. He was not messing around. Brandon did sometimes get himself into trouble with the law. He forged a few checks and allegedly stole from people. In late 1993, now this should tell you this is 30 years ago, when Brandon was 20 years old, he left the town he lived in Lincoln, and set out for somewhere new. Some say he was running from the law, others say he just wanted to start over in a new town. Others say it was to start over in a town that hadn't ever known him as anyone but Brandon. Brandon settled in the town of Humboldt, 80 miles away from Lincoln. From the first day he arrived, Brandon became one of the boys. Despite his short stature, Standing 5'5", people got to know Brandon as a pleasant, baby-faced young man. He played cards with the other men in the local bars, chatted about the women, knew a lot about cars, and shaved every morning. There was something different about Brandon, how he treated the woman he liked. In towns like Humboldt, there is a high rate of domestic violence. It's not hard to assume that many of the women who grew up there had a fair share of misogynistic comments at the very least. Not long after he arrived in Humboldt, Brandon met Lisa Lambert. She was soon head over heels with this charming, soft-spoken young man. But Brandon, on the other hand, had his eyes set on someone else. By December, Brandon was dating Lana Tinsdale. The 19-year-old was a striking blonde with kind eyes. She and Brandon made a good-looking couple. Lana only knew Brandon as a young man, as Brandon didn't share any details of his past life with her and his female genitalia. In one conversation with a friend, Lana made a passing comment about the small size of Brandon's penis. It is unclear whether Lana brought this up because it bothered her or was something she felt confused about. But her friend reassured her that Brandon was a great guy, so it didn't really matter. One of the local men who Brandon hung around with occasionally was Tom Neeson. Tom was married with 2 small children and had previously spent time in prison. Sometimes the pair spent time with fellow ex-con John Lauder, Lana's ex-boyfriend, and over Christmas of 1993, Philip Devine, a young African-American man, joined the group since he was dating Lana's sister. Even though Brandon had started a new life in Humboldt, some of his old ways started to creep back in. He didn't have a job and therefore had no money, and he liked to spoil the women, and he was in love with Lana, so Brandon found himself forging checks again. Shortly after this celebration of his 21st birthday on December 12th, Brandon ended up in jail. Following the strip search, he was placed in the women's section. The idea of her boyfriend, of Lana's boyfriend, being surrounded by women confused her because she is still clueless that he has female genitalia. That being said, she's still organized for Brandon to be bailed out a week later. Tom was the one that posted the bail. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the group, including Brandon and Lana, attended a Christmas Eve party at Tom's house. A week later, Brandon is dead. And the lead up to that horrific incident started with a cold winter's night at that Christmas party. At the Christmas party, Brandon would have had no idea at the time, but getting arrested practically signed his death warrant. Now everyone was talking about the fact that Brandon was actually a female. It was public information when the Falls City Journal identified him as a female in its weekly arrest listings. Yes, this was a time when newspapers went out and they would list everybody that was arrested. When Lana picked up Brandon, she noticed he had visible breasts. That was obviously because he hadn't been able to bind like he usually did. Lana confronted him about his gender, and Brandon confessed he was born female but was transitioning to male. Despite finding out this rather surprising information, Lana decided she wouldn't cut things off with Brandon since they had gotten along so well leading up to this point. Lana's mother was adamant that she had to immediately break things off with Brandon, but she went against these wishes. She really liked Brandon, but at this point, she did not care about anything. She didn't care what her mom had to say. She didn't care about the female genitalia. She liked Brandon. In the aftermath of what happened on December 4th and December 30th, Lana maintained that no one bothered her about the fact that she was still dating Brandon after word spread about her being born female. However, she admits things drastically changed at the Christmas Eve party. Tom and John were very drunk, and that is when they started badgering Lana about being with Brandon. They didn't like the idea of her being with someone different, an issue probably compounded by the fact that John previously dated her and most likely still had a thing for her. So these two geniuses, John and Tom, grabbed Brandon and ripped his pants off, demanding Lana to look at what was between his legs. They wanted Lana to tell them that Brandon was a woman. Lana says she covered her eyes and ignored their request. They pushed the issue, so she looked but didn't say anything. Shortly after this incident, John told Lana to go back home. Since Brandon wasn't welcome there anymore, Lana left without Brandon despite him begging her to stay. Lana promised she would be back. Once she was out of the house, Tom and John turned their attention back to Brandon. Brandon had retreated to the bathroom, but Tom followed him inside and sucker punched him in the stomach. When Brandon fell to the ground, he was then repeatedly kicked. Brandon was then dragged out to a car and taken out to a secluded spot where no one would see what they were doing. Tom forced Brandon to remove his pants, and Brandon pleaded with Tom not to hurt him. Tom then violently sexually assaulted Brandon, repeatedly telling him he was a girl. John went next. After they were done with their attack, this horrible, horrible attack, Brandon was again hit and kicked. They've already done the most to him, but they just continue hitting and kicking him. Brandon staggered back to find Lana. His lip had been busted and his body ached. He had no jacket or shoes on in the cold night air, eventually making his way home. Tom and John left Brandon with a very clear threat. He wasn't going to tell anybody about what happened. When Lana laid eyes on Brandon, she pressed him to tell her what had happened. When she found out what the men had done to Brandon, she urged him to go to the police. However, Lana thought this was the best for Brandon, to get justice for what had happened to him, but the complete opposite would occur. Brandon's time in the hospital was invasive enough, but trying to report the incident was on another freaking level. It's almost sickening. This was the first time that Richardson County Sheriff Charles Locks had heard of someone being born one gender and identifying as something different. Instead of having an ounce of understanding and trying to establish the facts of this case, his questioning focused mainly on asking rude, derogatory comments about who Brandon was. The questioning actually made me sick. I just couldn't believe how horrible people could be. He was even later referring to him as it. His questions were, why do you make girls think you are a guy? What does that have to do with me being essayed? I don't know. After he pulled your pants down and saw you were a girl, what did you do? Did he fondle you or anything? Another question. You didn't look? Did he take a little time working it up or what? Did you work it up for him? I think this goes beyond the sexual identity. I think he just had an issue just all around. just like a really, really bad person. And people voted for him to be sheriff, which is scary. These were all direct quotes of things Charles Locke said to Brandon. Brandon kept his reply short or didn't reply at all due to the invasive and unnecessary nature of the questioning. This led to him being labeled as uncooperative. However bad those statements were, we can assume something far worse was said at the end of the tape. Why? Because the portion was conveniently erased. Brandon left after signing a document detailing the incident. He assumed John and Tom would then be arrested. He went to the hospital right after. He knew who his attackers were. They're gonna be arrested, right? Well, let me continue. It took 3 days for authorities to even question the men. I will repeat. It took 3 days for them to even question them, not arrest them, to question them. After speaking to them, those officers felt comfortable that they should be arrested. But this amazing sheriff, and I say that in a very condescending way, Charles Locke, refused. Brandon's sister heard about what happened, and on December 29th, she called Sheriff Locke and asked why Tom and John hadn't been brought in yet. He basically told her to just butt out. It was none of her business. Charles Locke refusing to arrest those men was a ridiculous decision, a decision that held fatal consequences. Charles Locke is definitely one of the villains in this story, in my opinion. On December 31st, 1993, Anna Mae Lambert drove up to the farmhouse her daughter Lisa Lambert rented to visit her and her 8-month-old son, Tanner. Minutes later, at roughly 10:20 a.m., she placed a frantic 911 call to the police. The Richardson County Sheriff's Department tasked the Humboldt Rescue Squad with dealing with the call. Anna Mae had reported multiple dead individuals at the farmhouse, one of which might have been a baby. The rescue crew got moving. They drove the short stretch outside of town with a doctor and a deputy, Ray Harold, in tow. I can't imagine what they expected when they pulled up, but I can guarantee what they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. The first body they found was a young African-American man. Notably, he had a prosthetic leg leaning against the couch. The man wasn't moving and had a coffee table over his lap. Upon closer inspection, Deputy Harold found a gunshot wound to the face. The entrance wound was on his lower jaw. The bullet exited from the right side of his head. The scene around the body seemed eerily calm, hardly like a fight or any other altercation had taken place. It looked like the man had taken his own life, but that theory had an added complication. There wasn't a gun next to the body. The search of the rest of the house continued. Harold found a woman sitting at the dining room table. She had a baby in her arms and was feeding him. It was Anna Mae Lambert. She told Harold that she didn't want to disturb the house unnecessarily and that the baby was her grandson. Her daughter was one of the deceased. Anna Mae told Harold to go to take a look in the bedroom. He peered around the doorway and noticed that the floor was covered in water. The mattress in the room was a waterbed, and it was punctured and was slowly leaking. On the waterbed were 2 bodies, a blonde woman and a young man with brown hair. They had each been shot execution style in the head. The crime scene was thoroughly searched, but there was no sign of a weapon anywhere. Harold called for backup, and eventually Sheriff Locke arrived. He recognized Brandon right away from the previous weekend's interaction. Brandon was found laying on his back with his leg over the edge of the waterbed. His hands were covered in blood, and his sweatshirt showed large blood stains over his abdomen. His previously white socks were now pink after being soaked with the blood-tinged water from the mattress. When Brandon's body was inspected, a gruesome knife wound was found on his stomach. He was shot in the head at point-blank range with a bullet under his chin. Brandon's skull was also fractured. These marks were not found on anyone else, which led investigators to believe that Brandon was the target. Lisa Lambert was the person next to Brandon, the girl who had fallen in love with him when he first arrived. Lisa had been shot through the right eye. Another gunshot was found to her stomach. Nebraska State Parole's evidence collection unit was called in. They drove the 80 miles to Lincoln and upon looking at the scene, called in an accident reconstruction expert to examine tire tracks found outside the farmhouse since they were too disrupted to get a cast done. The next port of call was to dust for fingerprints and search for any clues of who was responsible. A single footprint was discovered near the front door and was recovered. Rewinding back to the day of their deaths, because John and Tom now know that Brandon went to the police, so they picked up a rope, a hatchet, and some spare clothes. They went out looking for Brandon. They drove the hour's drive to his hometown in Lincoln, but he wasn't there. They continued to look at multiple other spots where he might be, still failing to find him. What we know happened next is according to one man, and that is Tom Neeson. This is his version of events in a confession he made to not be sentenced to death, but witnesses seem to corroborate these claims as well. John, on the other hand, denies that this story is true. After not finding Brandon, both men were angry and basically riled up, so they started to drink. Tom says that John was the one who first brought up getting rid of Brandon since he was the only eyewitness to the assault. The fact that Brandon had spoken to the police didn't sit right with John. He didn't like snitches. John told Tom that they could lure Brandon to a secluded spot, tie him up, and then dismember him, making the corpse unidentifiable. In John's mind, their problems would be over. Something they both said to multiple people leading up to the murder. And I wish at least one of those persons would have said something, but they didn't, and here we are. On December 30th, Brandon arrived at the police station for his follow-up interview. As he got inside, Brandon spotted Tom. He turned around and walked out, calling his mother. She begged Brandon to just please come home, Brandon, come home. He told her not to worry, he'd be there on the 3rd. Unbeknownst to Brandon, Tom and John were finalizing their plans to end his life that same day. John got a pair of golden gloves and a knife from his mother's house. They then went to a man called Eddie Bennett's house and stole a gun from him, pretending to just be popping in for a visit. That night, John and Tom arrived at Lana's house with one goal. Lana and her mom were home, but Brandon was not there. Lana's mom, on the other hand, was happy to point them in the direction, though. He was staying at Lisa Lambert's place, a rented farmhouse. Go out there and find him, you two criminals. I'm sure everything's gonna be fine. This is a grown woman, a mother. John allegedly this same night told Lana that he felt like killing someone and that she was next, adding, "I'm sorry, I hope you all don't hate me." This interaction greatly confused Lana. Still, she didn't call to tell Brandon that John and Tom had been over asking for him and that they were perhaps on their way over to him. which is odd. When they arrived, John kicked the door in and went straight to the bedroom. He found Lisa lying in the bed with her infant son in the crib next to her. Naturally, Lisa was startled to find him suddenly in her house, but before she could ask a question, he was barking at her to tell him where Brandon was. She wouldn't tell them, so they started searching the house. Brandon was hiding under a blanket at the foot of Lisa's bed. Tom yanked him up before John stabbed him in the stomach. Lisa was screaming, but Tom ignored her. He instead picked up Tanner and handed him to Lisa. Tom claims that when Lisa placed her son on the bed aside her, she was shot in the stomach by John. Tom asked Lisa who was in the house. She told them Philip Devine was next door. He had been staying with Lisa after having a fight with his girlfriend. Tom stormed off to find Philip and dragged him into Lisa's bedroom. He then shot her a second time. Philip begged for his life, but he was taken to the living room and made to sit on the couch. John shot Philip twice where he sat. Then he was back to Lisa's room, where he left off more shots, one of which fatally wounding Brandon. They then fled the home and tried to get rid of the evidence, throwing the gloves and murder weapons into the river. Somehow, they missed the fact that the gloves had landed on a patch of ice. When police discovered the item, they found a gun and a knife shoved inside. The knife was in a leather sheath with the name Lauder on it. It doesn't get much more incriminating than having your name on the murder weapon. Tom Neeson and John Lauder were arrested in the afternoon hours of December 31st, and Tom was quite happy to tell detectives what he had seen John do. Tom Neeson's full name, Marvin Thomas Neeson, and he was the first to go on trial. It began in February of 1995. Tom had been happy to speak with the media leading up to the trial. He admitted to Playboy that he had been part of both the murder and the SA. John had also told a cellmate a detailed account of the incidents. He was not an easy man to defend, but a prosecutor's dream. After an 18-hour deliberation, the jury found Tom guilty of first-degree murder of Brandon, though he was referred to as Teena Brandon during the trial. Shockingly, despite Tom and John going into them knowing they would kill whomever was in the house, Tom was only found guilty of second degree of Lisa Lambert and Philip Devine. He wasn't to be sentenced until after John Lauder had been tried, and he knew he could very well be facing the death penalty. Tom was quite happy to testify against John at his trial to save his own butt. John's trial started in mid-May 1995. The prosecutor told the jurors of John's motives. He wanted to get rid of the person who could send him to jail. It is shocking how a human being could ever rationalize something like this. Instead of going to jail for SA, you kill 3 people, and then what? You think you're magically going to get away with it because you threw some of the items in the river? Not that you didn't tell people, not that you didn't make yourself as guilty looking as possible. The knife found on the river had John's name on the sheath, and Brandon's blood was positively identified on it. Psychiatrists were brought in to testify about John's mental capabilities. One said he was mentally impaired and may not have known what he was doing was wrong, but others agreed that he knew what he was doing wrong enough to try and evade law enforcement by throwing the weapons into the river. Rhonda McKenzie, John's girlfriend at the time, took the stand and testified that he threatened to kill Brandon in the week leading up to December 30th. Then at 2:30 a.m. on December 31st, he woke up Rhonda and asked her to give him an alibi. Tom, taking the stand, was a last-minute deal struck up with the state. He would avoid the death penalty and nothing he said could be used against him. John's defense attorney tried to stop this, but the judge let Tom take the stand. He told the court everything, from the buildup to the actual incident, to how they committed and what they did after. John was furious with Tom and took the stand himself, something his lawyer begged him not to do. He denied everything Tom had said, but wasn't smart enough not to catch himself in an obvious lie. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Lotter guilty of 3 counts of first degree, among other charges. The prosecution requested the death penalty. Brandon's mother, Joanne Branson, sued Charles Locks in Richardson County for wrongful death, accusing him of blatant negligence in the case that resulted in her child's death. He purposely blocked deputies from arresting Tom and John, which he justified by saying it was intentional so they could get the facts. Who were they questioning? What facts? They had the facts. The case was initially dismissed, but Nebraska Supreme Court forced the case to be reinstated. Charles Locks had told John Lotter and Tom Neeson about Brandon's complaint against them, but did nothing to protect him from retaliation. The court ended up siding with Joanne, but awarded her just $17,000, saying Richardson's court was 15% at fault. The Nebraska Supreme Court ordered the court to pay further damages to Charles Locke's role in the entire situation. She was awarded $80,000. But no amount of money could bring Brandon back. Now we get to the appeal. John fought his conviction once he was behind bars. He was not aware Tom would be testifying against him and claimed he had simply stabbed Brandon. John claimed that Tom was the one who fired the gun and said the DNA found on the weapons, the gloves, and the clothing worn that night would prove it. In 2001, John petitioned Richardson County District Judge Daniel Bryan to test the items. The prosecutors didn't agree with this, bringing up the fact that John had every chance to bring up DNA at the trial, but he didn't. John's attorney argued that the type of DNA testing they would use had not been available in 1995 when they went on trial, and the DNA evidence wouldn't be admissible in the Nebraska courts until 2 years after John's trial. Judge Bryan denied John's request. There were multiple reasons that what John was asking for wouldn't prove who had shot the victims, and the blood splatter evidence wouldn't indicate that either. And it didn't really matter. They were both present, so they're both guilty. But anyways, in 2003, John's attorney petitioned the Nebraska Supreme Court asking for a new trial, arguing that the judge in John's trial didn't allow testimony from inmates who shared a cell with Tom Neeson and heard information that showed Tom was the one who pulled the trigger. On July 11, 2003, Nebraska's High Court found that John Lotter was not due a new trial. In September of 2007, John Neeson changed his story. He recanted his testimony against John and said he was the one who shot Brandon, admitting that John wasn't the one who committed the murders. John tried to use this to claim his innocence, but this was rejected by the Nebraska Supreme Court in 2009. It maintained that both John and Tom were involved in this crime. Who the shooter was irrelevant. John has continued on with appeals, but they are still being denied. His third appeal made it to the United States Supreme Court, but it was denied in 2018. Both men remain behind bars, as those monsters deserve, and they do not deserve a retrial, in my opinion. While this story focuses on Brandon Teena and the tragic loss of his life, I think it is important we also make a point to acknowledge those who lost their lives alongside him. Lisa Lambert was a kind young woman with a son she loved dearly. She opened her home to both Philip, who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and to Brandon, who must have felt like he didn't have anyone on his side in the whole town of Humboldt. Lisa's kindness, Brandon living his authentic life, and Philip needing a place to lay his bed for the night is what got them all killed. Regardless of who pulled the trigger, both John and Tom were over to the house that night, knowing exactly what they were going to do, and spending the rest of their lives behind bars is where they belong. Let's leave a red heart in the comments for Brandon and his surviving family that were cut short of an amazing person for no reason at all. And again, thanks to Woodoku for sponsoring today's video. The link will be in the description box. Thanks to all my channel members and my Patreons who continue to support me. If you would like early access to new videos or decide the cases I cover next, you can do so by clicking the join button from your desktop, or there is a video in the description box on how to do it from your phone. Well, if you've made it to the end, you are a rock star, and I love you to death. There are more true crime videos in my Crimey Cases playlist for you to check out. I love you guys to death, and remember, if you see something, say something. Bye.